Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the haunting case of the Ashcroft widow and the devastating secret that lays sealed within a quiet room in rural Missouri that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time. A truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. On the morning of June 12, 1904, a silence that had been gathering for years was about to be broken. It began not with a scream, but with a scent. A farmer named Harold Deems, his face etched with a reluctant urgency, rode into the sheriff's office in Moberly, Missouri. His words, tangled in the breathless heat of a Missouri summer, painted a picture of deep wrongness. For nearly 3 weeks, no one in the small, tight-knit community of Buckner Ridge had seen the Ashcroft children. Not a glimpse of them in the yard, not a whisper of their laughter on the wind. There was only the house, sitting still and watchful on its hill. And now, a smell. Something sweet and cloying. A sickly perfume that drifted from the homestead and settled heavy in the surrounding fields. A scent that spoke of decay masquerading as peace. The man tasked with investigating this unsettling quiet was Sheriff Andrew Carver. At 38, Carver was new to his role, having held the office for just under 6 months. His tenure had been defined by the mundane quarrels of rural life, land disputes, tavern brawls, petty theft. He had never stared into the face of true, calculated darkness. But the farmer's report, delivered with trembling conviction, left no room for hesitation, accompanied by his deputy, Nolan Price. Carver saddled his horse and began the 11-mile journey to the Ashcroft place. They arrived under a pale, merciless sky. The sun punished the dry earth, bleaching the world of color. At the top of the hill, the Ashcroft house stood as a monument to stillness, a 2-story wooden structure, its paint peeling under the strain of countless seasons, yet its bones sturdy. The shutters were drawn tight against the light. The front porch, once a chaotic landscape of children's toys, was now swept clean, barren. Nothing moved. An oppressive silence pressed in on them, so thick it felt like a physical weight. Sheriff Carver dismounted, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. He knocked once, the sound swallowed by the immense quiet. No answer. He called out her name, Mrs. Ashcroft. The silence held. Then, just as he stepped back, the front door creaked open of its own accord, and there, in the shadowy threshold, stood Eleanor Ashcroft. She was a figure carved from another season, wearing a long black dress buttoned to the collar, its dark wool an act of defiance against the sweltering heat. Her auburn hair was pinned back in a coil so tight it seemed to pull at her temples. Her pale, drawn face carried no expression Carver could easily name. It was not fear, not guilt, and most disturbingly, not grief. It was a terrifying placidity, a calm that seemed to have been purchased at an unbearable price. "Miss Ashcroft," Carver began, his voice careful, measured. "We're just here to check in. The neighbors are worried. They haven't seen the children." Eleanor paused. Her eyes, the color of a faded sky, drifted past the two men, focusing on something distant, something only she could see. A faint nod, a flicker of acknowledgement, as if she were an actress remembering her lines in a play she had rehearsed 1,000 times. "They're sleeping," she said, her voice unnervingly even. "Please don't wake them." With a gesture that was both an invitation and a dismissal, she stepped aside. Carver hesitated for only a moment before crossing the threshold, Deputy Price following close behind. The air inside was cooler, but unnaturally so. It was the chill of a room long denied the sun, the cold of a place where life had ceased to circulate. Every curtain was drawn tight, plunging the parlor into a perpetual twilight. The air was heavy, weighted with the same medicinal sweetness from outside, now mingled with the scent of beeswax and something else, something final. The room was clean, too clean. It was the sterile, untouched order of a museum exhibit. No books left open, no scraps of sewing left in a basket, no discarded toys that spoke of the joyful chaos of 4 children. On the dining table, 5 plates were set, empty, washed, waiting for a meal that would never be served. It was this detail, this tableau of domesticity frozen in time, that sent the first real shiver of dread down Carver's spine. When Deputy Price stepped into the adjoining kitchen, he stopped abruptly. On the windowsill, catching the faint light that bled through the curtains, sat a neat line of empty medicine bottles. 2 were labeled laudanum. Another, paregoric, tinctures of opium, sold over the counter for everything from coughs to sleeplessness, remedies or poisons. To understand the chilling order within those walls, one must first understand the world outside them, the isolated, unforgiving landscape of rural Missouri at the turn of the 20th century. Buckner Ridge was not just a place on a map, it was a state of mind. It was a community carved out of the wilderness, a patchwork of farms connected by dirt roads and shared hardship. Here, self-reliance was not a virtue, it was the primary condition for survival. Families were islands, their internal affairs protected by an unwritten but sacred code of privacy. To question how a man ran his farm, how a woman raised her children, or how a family grieved its losses was more than impolite. It was a trespass. This unspoken contract created a society that was at once close-knit and deeply isolating. Neighbors might help raise a barn or share a harvest, but they would not, under any circumstances, knock on a door to question the silence behind it. The Ashcroft house itself seemed to embody this paradox. Perched on its hill, it was both a part of the community and eternally separate from it. It was a landmark, a point of reference. But over time, it had become a fortress. Its drawn curtains, like eyelids, sealed shut against the world. This was an era with no language for the intricate agonies of the mind. The human soul was a simpler thing in the public imagination, governed by God, hard work, and moral fortitude. Conditions we now recognize as clinical depression, post-traumatic stress, or psychosis were invisible. They were dismissed as melancholia, a case of the nerves, or, in women, the deeply flawed and damning diagnosis of female hysteria. There was no system of support, no social safety net, no one to call. Despair had no diagnosis, and so it had no treatment. It was a private affliction, a burden to be carried alone, preferably behind closed doors, until it either passed or consumed you. In this world, a woman suffering in silence was not seen as a person in crisis. She was simply seen as strong. And at the heart of this isolated world, in that house on the hill, was a woman who, for a time, seemed its perfect embodiment. Before she was the spectre in the black dress. Eleanor Ashcroft was the model of provincial grace. Born Eleanor Bennett, she was considered educated for her time, a graduate of normal school who had taught primary classes for 2 years. She was a woman of quiet poise and literary sensibilities, occasionally submitting short poems to the Moberly Monitor. In 1892, she married Edward Ashcroft, a reserved, orderly man who worked for the railroad. He was proud of his family, a man who kept ledgers not just for farm expenses, but for the frequency of his children's colds. Together, they built a life that was, by all outward appearances, the epitome of the American rural dream. They had 4 children in quick succession: Charles in 1893, followed by Ruth Buxsey und Edith, and finally Thomas in 1899. Local ministers spoke of the Ashcrofts admiringly from the pulpit. They were upright, industrious, God-fearing. Eleanor, in particular, was an object of quiet admiration among the women of the town. They whispered about how she managed 4 young children with such composure, how her household remained pristine, how she taught them all to read before the age of 5. She was, in a word, impeccable. But perfection carries a heavy weight, and Eleanor carried hers in silence. As a neighbor, Martha Pritchard would later recall in journals discovered by county archivists. Eleanor rarely accepted help. She always insisted things were under control, even when her husband traveled for work, leaving her alone with 4 children under the age of 7. The first crack in this perfect facade appeared in the spring of 1901. Edward, away on a work trip near Kansas City, contracted typhoid fever and died within 10 days. His body was shipped home by train. At the depot, Eleanor, now a 33-year-old widow, received the casket. The community watched, expecting a collapse, a public display of grief that would affirm their own sympathies. But it never came. Eleanor stood dry-eyed. She planned the burial alone. She accepted the food brought by neighbors with a polite, distant gratitude. The community, having performed its duty, assumed she was managing as Eleanor always did, with quiet strength. They gave her space. They gave her silence. They did not see that the silence was beginning to fester. The true portent of the coming storm was not in her stoicism, but in her art. She continued to write poetry, but the tone shifted, turning inward and dark, a preoccupation with winter, with sleep, with a quiet that bordered on oblivion, began to bleed onto the page. In November of 1901, the Moberly Monitor published a short 4-line verse she had submitted. At the time, it was read as a quaint, if slightly melancholic, reflection on childhood discipline. Read in hindsight, it is a chilling prophecy, a declaration of intent hidden in plain sight. It read, "They do not cry when winter comes, nor ask the lamb to stay, for children kept in quiet rooms learn not to disobey." That small, chilling verse, printed on cheap paper in the local Monitor, was at first dismissed as little more than a morbid curiosity, the product of a grieving but poetic mind. Yet, as the seasons turned and 1901 bled into 1902, those 4 lines began to feel less like a reflection and more like a quiet manifesto. The first tangible evidence of the change was the slow, systematic disappearance of the Ashcroft children from public life. It began with their absence from the Methodist church pews on Sunday. At first, this was attributed to the harshness of a Missouri winter, or the simple difficulty for a lone widow to manage 4 young ones. But when the snows melted and the dogwoods bloomed, their absence stretched into the spring, then the summer. By autumn, when Eleanor appeared at all, she appeared alone, a solitary figure in a sea of families. The school board soon noted that Charles and Ruth had not been re-enrolled for the new term. A formal declaration for home instruction was expected, but none was ever filed. They simply vanished from the official register, their names becoming ghosts in the attendance ledgers. It was during this period that Martha Pritchard, whose farm was less than a mile down the road, felt a growing unease she could not name. She decided to act on it, baking a rhubarb pie and walking the familiar path to the Ashcroft home one afternoon in May. The house greeted her with its usual unnerving stillness. After her knock, the door opened only a few inches, just enough to reveal a sliver of Eleanor's face in the interior gloom. When Martha asked how the children were, explaining she hadn't seen them in weeks, Eleanor's response was not hostile, but it was profoundly final. "They are tired," she said, her voice a low monotone. "They need more rest than the world allows." She never opened the door further. She never invited Martha inside. The conversation and the visit was over. While the adults of Buckner Ridge traded confused whispers and then chose to look away, their own children began to report stranger things. These were stories told in hushed tones during school recess, tales dismissed by parents as youthful fantasy. Emma Jean Pritchard, Martha's youngest, later recounted to a teacher how, during a violent thunderstorm, she saw a boy from the Ashcroft house staring out of an attic window. She couldn't tell which one it was. He didn't blink. The girl insisted, her own eyes wide with the memory. He just stood there, looking like a picture. More than one child spoke of hearing a music box, its delicate, tinkling melody carrying across the fields late at night from the direction of the Ashcroft home. It was a strange detail, as no one in the town could recall the Ashcrofts ever owning one. These were the idle mutterings of children, fragments of a puzzle that would only be assembled in retrospect. Years later, when investigators tried desperately to understand how an entire family could unravel in plain sight, the pressure on the fragile reality of the Ashcroft household escalated in August of 1902 when a tangible piece of that hidden world broke free. It was a humid late afternoon when 7-year-old Ruth Ashcroft wandered onto the neighboring farm of the Harper family. She was barefoot, her small feet caked in dust, and wore only a thin cotton nightgown, a ghostly white against the green of the fields. This is Harper, alarmed, brought the child inside, gave her a piece of bread and jam, and gently asked where her mother was. Ruth's reply, delivered with the child's unnerving sincerity, provided the clearest glimpse yet into the inverted world of that home. "She's sleeping," Ruth said. "We have to be quiet when she's sleeping. If we wake her up, she cries." The girl then added another layer to the mystery. When asked if she wanted to stay and play, she shook her head. "I can't. She'll worry if I'm not back before the singing starts." Miss Harper, deeply unsettled by the girl's words, tried to follow up the next day. She walked to the Ashcroft house, but her repeated knocks were met only by the familiar, resolute silence. The curtains remained shut. When she returned the day after, Eleanor finally answered, her posture stiff, her face a polite, impenetrable mask. She thanked Mrs. Harper for looking after Ruth during her little adventure, her tone so placidly normal it made the entire incident feel surreal, as if a child wandering a mile from home in her nightclothes was a perfectly ordinary occurrence. Sheriff Carver would later identify this moment, the Harper visit, as the single most critical point at which the community might have intervened. But in 1902, the very concept of child welfare agencies did not exist. There were no mandatory reporting laws, no formal systems for evaluating the mental health of an isolated widow. A mother raising her children quietly on the edge of town was not a threat in the eyes of the law and the community. She was the norm. By 1903, the signs of decay were no longer subtle whispers. They were a roar that the community collectively chose to ignore. Eleanor Ashcroft's withdrawal from the world was now almost total. The family's front room mirror was removed. When asked why by the general store clerk, she replied, "I don't care for reflections anymore. They double what's already enough." The garden, once Eleanor's pride, a testament to her nurturing hand, had been left to rot. What were once neat rows of beans and squash had become a tangled, skeletal patch of brittle stalks and choking weeds. The laundry line behind the house, once always filled with clean, white sheets, now hung perpetually bare, even in the mildest weather. The family's only regular contact with the outside world was now through mail-order catalogs, and Eleanor's purchases became increasingly unusual. The local postmaster, a man privy to the small currents of town life, noted the orders. Large quantities of quinine and medicinal herbs, blank books and dozens of sewing needles. One order contained nothing but bolts of black fabric and 5 spools of dark gray thread. What she did not order was what drew the postmaster's attention. For a woman once renowned for teaching her children the alphabet by age 4, there were no slates, no chalk, no school readers, no writing paper. The education had stopped. In September of that year, a traveling salesman from St. Louis, Albert Kinley, offered a rare outside glimpse into the household during this final period, seeking directions. He approached the porch and heard what he assumed was a hymn. It was a woman's voice, soft and rhythmic, repeating a single line over and over. He knocked, and the singing stopped abruptly. After a long silence, the door opened a few inches. Eleanor stood just inside, her face obscured by the darkness. He offered a polite tip of his hat and asked the way to the next township. She stared at him for several seconds before replying, "South. The road bends to it." Then she closed the door. He would later report to the sheriff that he remembered seeing movement in the shadows behind her, a small figure, perhaps a child, standing very still by the staircase. But the house was dark, the curtains thick. He couldn't be sure. The final, and perhaps most horrifying incident before the complete silence descended occurred in early December. The youngest child, Thomas, barely 4 years old, was seen standing in the middle of the road near the property, barefoot and shivering in the winter cold. A farmhand from the Pritchard place recognized the boy, brought him back up the path, and knocked at the Ashcroft door. Eleanor opened it within seconds. She offered no thanks. She asked no questions. She merely looked down at the shivering child and said, her voice flat and devoid of all warmth, "He knows better." She then pulled the boy inside without another word. The next day, the farmhand swore he saw something new and terrifying. A thick blanket had been nailed across the inside of that same door, sealing it shut from the world. As he later recounted, that house didn't feel like a place where children played anymore. It felt like something was being contained. The final descent began, by most accounts, in mid-May of 1904. This was when the Ashcroft household fell completely out of sight. No more mail was collected, no packages picked up from the general store, and most unsettling of all, the complete and total silence of the children. This unnerving quiet might have gone unnoticed longer in a busier township, but in Buckner Ridge, it caused a deep, collective unease that finally culminated on June 11th. That was the day the Deems boy, out mending a fence line, got the full force of the smell wafting from the Ashcroft property. He followed it, against his better judgment, to the edge of the land. What he saw sent him running back to his father. The family dog, Rufus, was buried in a shallow grave in the withered garden, a shovel still sticking from the disturbed earth. And something else. A single child's shoe, half covered in mud, lying abandoned beside the porch steps, The boy was sure it was Edith's. This was the final piece of evidence, the tangible proof that could no longer be ignored or explained away. On the morning of June 12th, 1904, Sheriff Andrew Carver and Deputy Nolan Price returned to the Ashcroft residence. This time, there was no hesitation. They came with purpose and with the warrant. The scattered reports had now reached critical mass: the smell, the uncollected mail, the boarded windows, and now the family dog found dead in the soil. As they rode, Carver felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. This was no longer about a reclusive widow. It was about 4 missing children, and every instinct he possessed told him they had not simply been sent away. When they arrived, the house looked unchanged from Carver's first visit, a silent sentinel of decay. But this time, the door, which had once required a firm knock, creaked open before they touched it. Eleanor Ashcroft was waiting. She stood in the center of the parlor, hands folded neatly before her, dressed all in black. There was no panic in her demeanor, no defensiveness, just an absolute, unnerving stillness. "You came," she said simply. The sheriff noted her tone, flat, but not hostile, polite, almost, like someone greeting expected guests at a wake. Carver excused himself and took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding a heavy rhythm against his ribs. The cloying medicinal odor grew stronger with each step. A sweet veil of death. The bedroom on the left side of the second floor was cool and dim. The windows, as a merchant had reported, were completely boarded from the inside, plunging the room into a sealed twilight. 4 small beds lined the walls. Each was neatly made, and each was occupied. Charles, Ruth, Edith, and Thomas lay beneath their sheets, their faces pale, their bodies still. They looked peaceful, too peaceful. Sheriff Carver, his breath catching in his throat, approached the closest bed, Ruth's. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her wrist. It was cold, a pulseless, unmistakable cold that had nothing to do with the chill of the room. He checked the others quickly, his movements now brisk, desperate. No movement, no breath, no color. Edith still held a small cloth doll clutched in stiff fingers. Charles, the oldest, wore his Sunday shirt, tucked neatly into his trousers. Thomas, the youngest, was curled slightly to one side, his eyes closed but not tightly shut. They appeared to have been dead for days. In that moment, the weight of his office, the weight of this small town's ignored fears, crashed down upon Andrew Carver. This was a failure, a colossal failure. And he was the one standing at its horrifying epicenter. Downstairs, Eleanor had begun to speak, her voice drifting through the silent house as if she were talking to no one in particular. "They used to cry so loudly," she said, her tone conversational, reflective. "The walls couldn't hold it. I tried singing, but they always knew. They always heard. Deputy Price, left alone with her, could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the gentle cadence of her voice with the horrific implications of the scene upstairs. When Carver returned, his face ashen, he needed only to signal the deputy. "Call the coroner," he managed to say, his own voice hoarse. "Call Dr. Crawford, now." Eleanor did not resist when she was placed under protective custody. She did not ask what they had found. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked to her rocking chair in the corner of the parlor, sat down, and began to hum a soft, unfamiliar tune. She rocked slowly, calmly, a portrait of maternal peace that was the most profound horror of all. "They're safe now," she said once, almost to herself. "I did what I had to do. Later, when asked directly why she had done it, she would answer without a flicker of hesitation, her logic impeccable within its own warped and broken framework. They were never going to make it. I saw what was coming. The cold, the hunger, the shame. I did what any mother would do if she knew how to listen. The full, devastating truth of Eleanor's mind was not to be found in her spoken words, but in a small, wooden box investigators discovered 6 days later during a second, more exhaustive search of the property. Deputy Nolan Price found a false panel in the floor of the master bedroom closet. Inside the box, wrapped in a threadbare shawl, were 11 unsent letters. They were not a diary, nor a journal, but a series of quiet, devastating confessions addressed to those she had lost or left behind: her late husband, her distant mother, her minister. They were the diary of a mind's undoing. An early letter, dated February 2nd and addressed to Edward, read: "You left too much behind and too little of yourself to carry it. They still ask for you sometimes. I tell them you're in the soil, growing things. They believe it. They believe everything I say. That's what terrifies me." These were not the ramblings of madness. The language was coherent, structured, even poetic. But the worldview they revealed was one of prolonged depressive psychosis, a reality distorted by grief, isolation, and exhaustion. Forensic psychologists, brought in later to assess her writings, would describe the letters as a slow descent into a moral logic only she could justify. In her mind, she was not a murderer, she was a protector, shielding her children from a fate she perceived as worse than death. She wrote of specific fears for each child: that Charles felt the weight of becoming a man too soon, that Ruth's beauty would attract cruelty, that Edith was too gentle for the world's harshness, and that Thomas's innocence was a flame that would inevitably be extinguished. One of the final letters, dated June 7th, was perhaps the most chillingly explicit. "I have sung them to sleep 1,000 times, but they always wake to more sorrow. This time, I will hum until they stay sleeping. There will be no cold, no hunger, no more winters without shoes, only peace. I will see them through the dark and close the door behind us." The letters also contain moments of harrowing lucidity, brief flashes where she seemed to recognize her own instability. In one entry, she wrote, "If someone would just knock, really knock, not for politeness, but to come in, maybe it would stop. Maybe I would open the door and say, 'Take them, please,' before I do what the voices suggest. But no one knocks like that. Not anymore." The official investigation began immediately. Dr. Emmett Crawford, the county physician who had been called to the scene, confirmed the sheriff's initial findings. His formal report, later entered into the trial record, was stark and clinical. Each child had ingested a fatal dose of opiates, most likely administered through warm milk or bread soaked in laudanum. There were no signs of struggle, no external trauma, save for some evidence that Charles, the oldest, may have resisted. As Dr. Crawford examined the children, he reportedly paused at Thomas's bedside and said to those present, "This was not rage. This was despair made deliberate." The autopsy reports confirmed lethal levels of morphine in each child's bloodstream. The milk residues found in the stomachs of the 3 youngest children told a story of a final poison meal. The care with which they had been dressed, their hair brushed, even their fingernails trimmed, was noted. "Dr." Crawford wrote in his summary, "This was not the aftermath of frenzy. This was preparation, ritual, perhaps even, in her mind, a kind of love." The press caught on quickly. By June 15th, regional papers were printing sensational headlines. The St. Louis Globe Democrat ran a front-page story under the title, Missouri Medea widowed mother poisons 4 in sleep. It painted Eleanor as a monstrous, unnatural figure. In contrast, the local Moberly Monitor took a more somber tone with its headline, Ashcroft Tragedy Stuns Heartland, focusing on the community's shock and grief. This fractured narrative defined the public's perception. Was she an angel of mercy, saving her children from a hard life? Or a cold-blooded murderess? The case became a topic of fierce debate, precisely because Eleanor Ashcroft did not behave like a killer. She didn't deny her actions. She didn't show remorse. In an interview with Sheriff Carver, she said, "I couldn't let the world take them. It takes children. Andrew, not all at once, slowly, with cold, with cruelty, with shame. I just made it faster." The legal authorities in Randolph County now faced a monumental question. Was Eleanor Ashcroft criminally responsible? Or was she mentally incapable of understanding her actions? The concept of an insanity defense existed in Missouri law in 1904, but it was rarely invoked and poorly understood, especially in rural counties that favored punishment over evaluation. On July 1st, a formal hearing was held in the sweltering heat of the Randolph County Courthouse to determine her fitness to stand trial. The room was packed with silent, somber townspeople. Dr. Buck Crawford and 2 other physicians from Columbia testified. They explained to a skeptical judge and a confused public the clinical basis for their conclusions, using the terms of the era puerperal insanity, chronic melancholia with delusional fixations. They argued that while Eleanor knew she was ending her children's lives, she lacked the moral and rational capacity to understand that her action was wrong, believing it to be a necessary, even loving, act of protection. After hours of testimony, the conclusion was unanimous. Eleanor Ashcroft was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial. Instead of a prison sentence, she was remanded to St. Mary's Hospital for the Insane, a state-run asylum, for indefinite custodial care, legally speaking, with no criminal trial and no formal charges filed. The case of the Ashcroft children ended that day, but in the court of public opinion, and in the silent, haunted halls of history. The question of justice had only just begun. In the aftermath of the Ashcroft case, after the legal proceedings drew to a quiet close, and Eleanor was removed to the asylum, the town of Buckner Ridge did not find peace. The legal resolution, which declared Eleanor insane rather than evil, offered no catharsis. It did not absolve the community. Instead, it plunged it into a different kind of reckoning, a quiet, internal audit of its own conscience. The silence that had once been a shield of privacy now felt like a shroud of collective guilt. In the weeks and months that followed, the story unraveled a second time, not in court, but in hushed conversations over fence posts and in the pews after Sunday service. A social scar had been carved into the town's soul. Drawn curtains were now viewed with suspicion, and the sound of a child crying, or not crying, carried a new and terrible weight. When approached by authorities, many neighbors, particularly the women who had once admired Eleanor, began to offer their quiet recollections. These were not accusations, but fragments of memory tinged with a deep, unspoken regret. Martha Pritchard, whose pie was never accepted, admitted to the sheriff, "I saw the curtains drawn for weeks at a time. I should have knocked harder, but she had always been so private. I didn't want to insult her by suggesting she wasn't managing." She would later confess to Mrs. Harper in a brief, tearful exchange at the general store. "We saw the fortress she was building, and we admired its high walls, never once thinking to ask about the prisoners inside." Reverend Arthur Bell, pastor of the Methodist Church, confessed his own failure. "She stopped attending services in '03. I wrote her once, but never followed up. We assumed she needed space, I suppose." He concluded, his voice heavy. We gave her too much of it. Perhaps one of the most unsettling testimonies came from Sarah Lyman, the schoolteacher who had once taught Ruth and Charles. She described visiting the property in early 1903, hoping to persuade Eleanor to re-enroll the children. Eleanor had greeted her kindly, but with a terrifyingly distant look. She had declined to come outside, insisting the children were better off learning here, where the world can't rearrange them. Sarah caught a glimpse of Charles standing in the hallway behind his mother. He didn't wave. He didn't blink. He just stood there, unnaturally straight. It wasn't natural, Sarah recounted, her voice trembling decades later. But I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, no procedure to follow. If a mother said she was teaching her children at home, we believed her. The deeper truth, the one that festered in the heart of the community, was that people had noticed, but they had chosen not to act. In rural Missouri at the turn of the century, to challenge how someone raised their children was not just taboo, it was a moral trespass. Deputy Nolan Price, reflecting years later, put it most plainly. We all thought someone else would say something, or that maybe we were imagining it. It wasn't denial. It was paralysis. In the weeks after the tragedy, a few townspeople left flowers by the Ashcroft gate. No one spoke the children's names aloud at their burial. It was a small, somber affair without eulogies. But in a final, poignant act of anonymous grief, one woman brought 4 pairs of children's shoes and placed them side by side at the base of the fence. She never explained why. She didn't need to. After Eleanor Ashcroft was transferred to St. Mary's Hospital for the Insane in Jefferson City, her former life was methodically erased. The Ashcroft farmhouse remained sealed, a wound on the landscape that no one dared to touch. Weeds overtook the dead garden. Wind blew shingles from the roof. Eventually, the house simply faded into the background, a place children dared each other to approach, whispering tales of a woman's shadow in the upstairs windows. Her remaining estate was catalogued 4 iron-framed beds, a modest writing desk, and a library of children's books, their pages filled with Eleanor's teaching notes that ended abruptly in 1903. The children were buried in the town cemetery, their headstones etched only with their first names, paid for by the sale of their father's remaining assets. Eleanor remained at St. Mary's for the rest of her life. The asylum, with its polished floors and rigid schedules, was a world away from the dusty isolation of her farm. Hospital records, preserved by the state, describe her as a model patient cooperative, lucid, but deeply and permanently detached from external reality. She followed routines. She folded laundry. But according to the nurse's logs, she never once asked about her children. Not by name, not in passing. It was as if that chapter of her life had been sealed off as completely as she had once sealed her home. One nurse who cared for Eleanor in her later years recalled that she would often set 5 places at a small table in the corner of the ward, 4 for the children, 1 for herself. She would serve imaginary meals, nodding gently as if responding to silent conversation. To the very end, Eleanor believed they were with her safe, sleeping and warm. In one of her final documented statements, recorded by a physician in 1926, she reportedly said, "We made it through the storm. They're warm now. That's all I ever wanted." She died of heart failure in January of 1927 at the age of 58. Her body was cremated, and with no family to claim her remains. Her ashes were interred without ceremony in the hospital's numbered graveyard. Her marker read only Patient 1134. The house stood empty for another 5 years until 1932, when a summer thunderstorm rolled over Buckner Ridge. A lightning strike set fire to the rear of the structure, and by the time neighbors noticed the flames, it was too late. The old wood caught fire with an almost eager finality, and the house collapsed within hours. It was, as Deputy Price later said, as if the land itself had decided it was time to forget. But forgetting was never complete. The story didn't disappear. It just went underground, becoming a cautionary tale, a ghost story too heavy to leave behind. To understand how a woman like Eleanor could slip through every social and medical safeguard of her time, we must first acknowledge that those safeguards did not exist. Conditions we now recognize as postpartum depression or trauma-related disorders were dismissed under the flawed diagnosis of female hysteria, a character defect, not a medical condition. In this context, Eleanor's story becomes less anomalous and more archetypal. She was not the first woman to experience psychological collapse under the crushing weight of grief and isolation. She was simply the one whose tragedy was visible enough to be recorded. Historical records from asylums across the American Midwest show a steady increase in women committed for what were then termed domestic breakdowns. A 1913 article in the American Journal of Insanity even used the term prairie melancholia to describe a condition where women in isolation, carrying unbearable burdens, often lost contact with reality. Eleanor Ashcroft was not a monster. She was the product of a system that demanded everything from its women and gave them nothing in return but silence. There are stories in American history that resist neat endings. The Ashcroft case does not close with a satisfying verdict or a moment of redemption. There is only stillness, 4 small graves, one lost mother, and a silence that lasted far longer than the lives it consumed. We look to stories like this for answers, a psychological diagnosis, a moral judgment, a systemic explanation. And while each of those offers a piece of the truth, none of them is whole. Because what happened in Buckner Ridge in 1904 wasn't just a failure of one person or even one community. It was the culmination of many failures, cultural, medical, and emotional, that wove themselves into a net so loose it caught no one until it was far too late. In the 1950s, a local historian named Louise Gerhardt was the first to academically re-examine the case. In her thesis, titled The Ashcroft Case and the Language of Rural Silence, she argued that the tragedy was not an aberration, but an inevitable outcome. Eleanor Ashcroft did not fall through the cracks, Gerhardt wrote. There were no cracks. There was no system. She was never held by anything in the first place. Society provided her with a defined role: mother, widow, stoic survivor, and then looked away, expecting her to perform it in isolation. Her break from reality was not a sudden snap, but a slow logical unraveling of a mind that had been given an impossible task with no tools. Her story, once buried in shame, was slowly rediscovered, cited in medical journals and gender studies seminars. A haunting testament to the unseen suffering of women. The story survives, not in the cold, official records of court proceedings or asylum registries, but in the echoes of what was left behind. It survives in the image of 4 small shoes left at a fence post. It survives in the haunting verse of a poem about quiet rooms. It survives because it forces us to confront the terrifying nature of silence itself. The Ashcroft story matters not because it is rare, but because it was recorded. How many others weren't? How many women buried their grief behind drawn curtains? How many children lived in homes where love turned into fear? And no one outside ever knew the historical record holds Eleanor's name, but it does not hold theirs. Today, the children's graves still stand in Cedar Hollow Cemetery. 4 headstones, weather-worn but legible, and year after year, anonymous offerings appear: tiny shoes, children's books, and single white flowers. No one knows who leaves them. Perhaps it doesn't matter. Because the legacy of the Ashcroft tragedy is a quiet monument to what happens when a mother's suffering is rendered invisible. And when a community confuses silence with strength, it leaves us with a final, enduring question. How many quiet rooms are still being sealed today? And are we listening closely enough to hear the silence behind the door?